Right, this is Mr. Reed coming at you live from S211 Brent School. I am going to be breaking down a passage from the Great Gatsby today to help you with looking for different components for your IOC. And this is a disclaimer, I am not doing an IOC today. This is just simply me helping you out, looking for different components, things that you could pick away at and talk about within a much larger scope of your IOC. So, instead of giving you one of the large passages, I decided to stick with something that we have already covered in class and see what things we could dive into and break apart here. The first thing with this passage, you should be familiar with this, I would begin talking a little bit about where and what is happening in the story when this event takes place. Where does this fall in line with the actual plot and its development? Is this a passage where tension is building? Is this where maybe some sort of character development is taking place? This is a descriptive passage, so it's going to be less about character development, more so about maybe pushing certain ideologies on its reader. It's heavily descriptive, so it's going to be loaded with lots of figurative language, especially symbolism and personification. So that being said, so once you've explained where this falls in line with the story, then you can kind of get into this, and we'll talk a little bit about context when I am done. So about halfway between West Egg and New York, we've already established that that is an example of metonymy, because these two things embody both principles and ideas. Ooh, that's a good start. There we go. All right, haven't had my coffee yet. So we have examples of metonymy here. From there, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile. So we know that Fitzgerald is big on the adjectives here, and this does help us give a little bit setting of the mood. And the road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it a quarter of a mile. Here, we also have an example, not so much of the literal term of parallelism, but it creates a sense of imagery of parallelism because we have this railroad and this mile. So there's a bit of a contrast in this pretty desolate space here. And then from there, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land, again, kind of helping with this sense of imagery, this sort of sense of desolate space, this place that is inhabited by people and yet seems like everything is sort of dying away. And so again, the sense of shrinking away is sort of watching things, that just the massive expanse of sheer emptiness. So here we can have an example of imagery. Okay. Just going through my notes here because there's quite a lot. All right, so this is the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, before I get into the sound devices here, let's talk a little bit about, again, the Valley of Ashes. We have also the desolate area of land here, so we're going to have this very strong use of imagery. But the Valley of Ashes is interesting because there's a lot more that you could do with this. The first one is obviously imagery, but we also have examples of how it could be a hyperbole, since clearly, valley is not covered in ashes. This is an example of symbolism, as it could be relating to the American dream, capitalism of some kind. It could be social commentary by Fitzgerald himself. And then this could also be an example of a metaphor, comparison of something to maybe something of a greater idea here. Finally, and I actually had to do a little research on this, as you should when you do your IOC, but this is actually also an allusion to The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, who Fitzgerald was a good friend of. And that poem also deals with this idea of, a crumbling society, one that is driven by hyper competition and capitalism, and sort of the degradation of morality and the generation, the youths. So we have that. And then we get into what I found to be a lot of sound devices. The first one is I think probably the most obvious is we have Fantastic Farm here. I'll give it pink, why not? All right, Fantastic Farm. Again, the reason, I don't want you to just identify the alliteration. I'd like you to tell me why maybe T.S. Fitzgerald is using Fantastic Farm here. Again, to stress an idea. But also, we have the hyphen, which separates the Valley of Ashes and Fantastic Farm. And there almost seems to be somewhat of a contrast here, or a juxtaposition, because they don't, obviously, Fantastic Farm and Valley of Ashes don't necessarily add up. They're not the same thing. So this device here is being used to sort of break his train of thought. And we'll go back into Nick's perspective in a second. But again, it seems like Nick has to sort of rethink his observations here, which makes him somewhat of an unreliable narrator. Oh, and there we go again. Okay, unreliable narrator. Where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally with a transcendent effort, etc., etc. Well, there's a lot of symbolism in here. And if you really want to go deep in here and kind of talk about all these different examples of wheat and grotesque gardens and houses and chimneys, and you could probably go on and talk a lot more about how these are neighborhoods that are sort of impoverished, or tie that back to sort of the bigger pictures and themes of this new money, old money, or appearance versus reality. But what I'd like to focus on more specifically is the sound devices, because that's something that I think a lot of students, when they do their analysis, they typically glaze over here. And there's so many. So Fantastic Farm is the first one, and then from there we have a lot of examples of sibilants and consonants. All right. So what just naturally sticks out of my mind is the use of S here and the different sounds that S creates. Not all these S's sounds are the exact same, but again, the fact that they're so overly used should tell you something about maybe this is being used intentionally. Grotesque gardens. Ashes. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight that. Forms. Houses, chimneys, rising, smoke. Okay, you kind of get the gist of this. The reason, again, for this is pacing. It's a little bit of a rhythm. It seems to sort of almost bounce, but it's also pretty quick. I'll get to the punctuation use in a second here as well, because that has to deal with the pacing. But again, that sound, the sibilants we identify with the snake. Snakes is symbolic for usually evil. I wouldn't say it's fair to say that these people are, evil, but again, it kind of creates this darker imagery. There's sort of something in decay. It's falling apart. And so those sound devices are intentionally used to kind of create this imagery in our head of those things. On the note of punctuation as well, if you look at this sentence here, this entire sentence, this is just one sentence. It's quite a long run-on sentence. It's divided with this hyphen here. Again, it's just sort of the packing of information, what Nick sees and how he absorbs the things around him. Are pretty negative, right? So consider Nick's perspective, somewhat biased. But also just in terms of Nick, he's someone who is very observational, And so he has lots of thoughts kind of going through his head as he is seeing this imagery, this escape sort of play out in front of him. And so there is a stylistic choice here, to have these run-on sentences and also have all of these sound devices, and this overall creates a sense of pretty quick pace. And then also the interruption with the comma here with the transcendent effort too. Okay, so that being said, let's move on to Right. Okay. Transcendent effort. So talking have a little commentary, and this could go back to some of the social commentary of Fitzgerald here. We talked about this in class, but I'll just reiterate this again: is that you have what looks like a tremendous amount of decay, and then you have this transcendent effort by men who are working in these neighborhoods, and just as they are working, they are rising above sort of the hardships of their everyday life. To do their best and to just sort of push through because they believe in the American dream, and yet at the same time they are literally crumbling, both maybe literally health-wise and then metaphorically as a community they are crumbling apart. So that being said, then we can bring back context, which is my last point here. And this is something that you will need to do a little bit of research on it and view Fitzgerald's political and his social views. As you saw, I was trying to make connections with those political and social views within this specific text and not spend too much time talking about, his own personal politics and maybe the things that he was involved with, because he was a pretty political writer and activist. But trying to plug that into this text and not get too thrown off with this overall passage here. So, there's a lot that could have also been broken down within this, but I kind of wanted to give you a feel for what you could look for when you were doing this, the things that you should look for when you're doing your IOC here. I'm sure there are things that I could have additionally added to, but again, when you only have 20 minutes, make sure that you are plugging in the information that you do know. And if you are having difficulty with sound devices, here's a nice little example of that. If there's something that I missed that you think that you should bring to my attention, please let me know, and I will add to it. So I hope you got a lot of good information out of this. Best of luck with your IOCs.